Good morning. Merry Christmas. Welcome to December. It's kind of interesting to me how our perspective on the timing of Christmas seems to change as we get older. Like I know I hear people all the time talk about how it seems the stores open earlier and earlier every year, and maybe they do, I don't know. But as we get older, for me, it seems like Christmas gets here way too fast. Like I just heard recently, we've got like 3.5 weeks till Christmas, and I just kind of freaked out, panicked. But if I remember back when I was a kid, it seemed the opposite. Like Christmas seemed to never get here. And I don't know if your house, you had anything like we had growing up. We'd always have some kind of countdown gadget. Like I remember one time there was some kind of house, and there was a door for every day of Christmas leading up. There's like a piece of candy in there to count down. One year I remember getting socks. It seemed like every day leading up to Christmas, some special pair of socks. And that stuff never really helped. It just kind of made it seem longer. The wait was longer. And I remember staring at those gifts under the tree like week after week, day after day. It was just kind of torment. But I'm curious, okay, when you were growing up, just play along at home here. How many of you actually went and searched the house for maybe the gifts that mom and dad were going to get for you that year? Right? How many of you, just raise your hand if this is you, how many of you found them at some point? All right, and of you that found them, how many of you actually got them out and played with them a little bit? Or was that just me? All right, here, one more question. How many of you that actually found them, played with them, ended up breaking them? Right? That just me again too. And what do you do with that? Do you try to like rewrap it, sneak it back in there? Christmas Day is like, oh, wow, Mom, it's broken. Anyway, the interesting thing is, okay, that dynamic of waiting and waiting and waiting, that was actually the same dynamic that set up the very first Christmas. And as we've been mentioning every week as we light the Advent candles, the word Advent actually means arrival. That's what we were celebrating. That's what they were waiting for. It was the waiting, the expectation of a coming hope that would one day arrive. But there's the meantime in which we just wait and we wait and we wait. And many of you may already know this, but for many, many generations, there was always a group, there was always a remnant of Jewish people who waited every single day for the arrival. Not the arrival of Santa Claus, but the arrival of the Messiah. In every single generation, there was this group of people who literally lived their lives every day as if today could be the day that the Messiah arrives. They lived every day in complete obedience to God's command, waiting for that day. But unlike the certainty of our Christmas day, which we know comes on the same day every year, for them, this went on for generation after generation after generation, and nothing happened. And like 99.999% of all of those people that waited for the Messiah, they died. And there was no fulfillment of that promise for them. And they prayed, and they waited, and they remained faithful. And while many of the Jews over time just kind of peeled off into other things, abandoned their faith even, or thought, that maybe this whole thing was just a fairy tale, maybe it was just a myth. And who in the world would devote themselves years and years to a promise that's a couple of thousand years old that's gone unfulfilled, or to a promise that's a couple of thousand years old? But there was always this group, there was always a remnant that got up every day and lived as if this could be the day that the Messiah shows up. Now, today is the second week of Advent. It's the first week we're beginning this new Christmas series. And I want to introduce you to two people who were waiting, who were part of this remnant. And their story, I think, is just so relevant to where many of us find ourselves right now. At some point, like if you haven't already, you're going to likely find yourself in a season where it just seems like God is so quiet and God is so inactive. God is just seemingly silent. And there'll be times in our lives when we can't help but look around and just kind of say, why am I even doing this? Why am I continuing to serve? Why am I continuing to give? Why am I believing? Why am I obeying? Why am I missing out on so much, right? Why in the world am I continuing to get up day after day after day and live my life as if there really is something bigger than me? Like there really is something to all this Bible stuff. Am I just following this because that's what my parents did? Is this just something that I'm afraid if I give it up or if I abandon my faith and somehow life's not going to go well for me? Is this really more superstition than something I really believe? And at some point in all of our lives, okay, including pastors, there are these seasons, there are these years, there are these seasons of life, periods in our lives where our attempts to be faithful and good Christian people We look around and we say, okay, what am I even getting out of this? Like, where is God in this? I mean, where is this going? Is there really anything to this? And if you've never had that thought, or you've never had those questions or those kinds of doubts, or maybe you're in one of those periods of doubt and questioning right now, either way, listen, this story is for you. In fact, in some way, this is your story. This is my story. Okay, here's how this begins in Luke. Luke chapter 1. He tells us when Herod was king of Judea, there was a Jewish priest named Zechariah. He was a member of the priestly order of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also from the priestly line of Aaron. So this meant that Elizabeth and Zechariah were both from the priestly line of Israel. It basically meant, okay, they were preachers' kids. In fact, they both come from a long line of what we would consider to be just holy religious leaders and priests. Anyway, this is kind of where we pick up some of the tension in their story. Luke tells us Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes, careful to obey all the Lord's commands and regulations, okay, which basically meant in context that the writer Luke believed, like when God looked at these two people, he went, they're doing it right, okay? You want a model for this? Look at the way they live. They're doing everything right. And here's what's kind of amazing, okay? They were doing everything they did as priests and followers of God based on a promise. They'd been given a couple thousand years earlier. And for the last 700 years, God had seemingly done nothing for the nation of Israel. And yet these two people get up day after day after day after day and live their lives every day as if today is the day that the Messiah is coming. They're living every day like Christmas is coming, right? Living their lives as if God is actually going to keep his promise and fulfill it. And again, okay, for them, there was no real evidence of this at all, going back for centuries of any of that. And maybe that's even a thought and a feeling you can relate to. And yet they're still doing everything right. And so we want to peer into their lives and say, okay, so Zacharias, so Elizabeth, all this righteous living, how's that working out for you? What are you getting from it? Well, look at the next verse. They had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they were both very old. So you're just getting up every day, day after day, waiting for Messiah, serving in the temple, being good people, right? Missing out on opportunities. And this God that you are so committed to being faithful to, who's been silent for centuries, has also left you without an heir, without any kids. Okay, and in this culture, it was always the woman's fault. And they knew, all they knew was when a woman couldn't get pregnant, as important as that is even in our culture, for a woman to have a baby in this culture, and I don't mean this to be offensive, but in this culture, that was really one of the very few things that a woman was good for. Like women back then were basically property. They had no political standing. They generally couldn't go to work. For the most part, they were always uneducated, right? And so for a woman not to be able to get pregnant, to have children, there was really this overriding sense in which God had cursed that woman for some unknown reason. And so Elizabeth, this righteous woman who lived blameless before God every day of her life, it wasn't going to happen for her. And they were both very old. God had seemingly done nothing for them lately. And we find out later in the story that they had prayed these desperate prayers of any couple, really, that would want to have a child. And God had said no. Elizabeth lived with the shame and the pain of this all the way into her old age. And now, okay, here's what's so ridiculous about that. Their entire faithfulness to God was based on a promise to Abraham 2,000 years ago from, when they lived in the first century. And I won't take time to go through like a whole Old Testament survey, but basically God had promised to bless Abraham and through his lineage bless the entire world. He was going to bless Abraham to be a blessing. Well, for a while, if you read the Old Testament, it started off like it was happening. This family became a nation who finally gained a promised land of their own, and then they became a kingdom, and that's when things really took off, right? And then there was King David, and there was King Solomon, and things grew and grew and grew. But then, okay, after Solomon, everything seemed to start falling apart. The nation split. There were wars, and there were good kings, and there were bad kings. And between the time of Solomon's kingdom, all the way up until the time we meet Elizabeth and Zechariah, the nation of Israel, all right, check this out. The nation of Israel during that time had changed hands over 25 times. The Syrians took them over, right? The Babylonians took them over. Greeks took them over. Persians took them over. They were exiled for 70 years at one point. The idea that the whole world was going to somehow be blessed through the nation of Israel, that no longer had any leverage, they had no wealth, no longer had any say-so, not even in their own future. Not only was it not going to happen, like it couldn't happen. And then, okay, finally, insult to injury. You read about this in your history book. 65 BC, Pompey the Great Roman general, he marches into Jerusalem, occupies the city again, pushes past the temple guards, marches right into the Holy of Holies in the temple. That place where the Jews believed, that's where God dwelled, okay? That place where only the high priest, he could only go in once a year and serve before God. It was the place the Jews believed if you went into the Holy of Holies unannounced, uninvited, that God would strike you dead. And the priest gasped as Pompey the Great walked right into the Holy of Holies, looks around, walks right back out, and nothing happened to him. And you can imagine, word spread quickly throughout Jerusalem, and the implications were pretty clear, okay? Obviously, Jupiter, the god of the Romans, must be more powerful than Yahweh, the God of Israel. Zechariah would have been a little boy when that happened. No doubt his father, just like Elizabeth's fathers, were priests during that area. They saw this happen. And no doubt he remembered the day his father come home and tore his robes and mourned because the temple had been desecrated with the presence of this Roman general who'd ignored all their customs and all their traditions and all the warnings. And he walks right into the Holy of Holies and walks right out, and God did nothing. God was silent. Sound familiar? And yet that little boy, with that in his background, went into the priesthood himself and served God his whole life. He marries Elizabeth, who serves God her whole life, both who remembered the emotion of why doesn't God do anything? And what about the promise to Abraham? And how in the world could this little itty-bitty tiny conquered nation ever impact the whole world? Like we're hanging on by a thread to exist in this world. And many Jews during this time, they turned away from their faith. They turned away from their belief in God. Many turned to the Greek gods or to the Roman gods because obviously by now it's over. But not everybody, right? Not Zechariah, not Elizabeth. And listen, if you had come to them at this point and you'd said, all right, listen, friends, I respect your strong faith, I do, but it's over. It's not happening. It was obviously a myth, okay? It's not going to happen. It can't happen. Yeah, some of Abraham's promise came true. We're a nation and Abraham is famous, but look around, man. Israel's never going to be a world player. You're just torturing yourself with all this stuff. Just enjoy the few remaining years of your life that you have, and because God, if there ever was a God, has abandoned you. He's abandoned us. And I can't help but wonder how many of you have ever maybe heard a voice in the back of your head kind of like that. Maybe just in your own mind, or maybe from people that you know. But if we had whispered that into their ears during these difficult years, we would have been wrong. Because the reason Luke begins his story with this story is because this was the beginning. This was the start of something brand new that would ultimately result in the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and to the whole world. And the reason this story is so important to you, the reason it's so important to me is because, as I said earlier, okay, there are these moments, we all have them. There are these periods, these seasons of our lives and in our relationships where we just can't help but wonder, okay, is God there? Is God still active? Is God listening? Does God even care? Well, at Christmas, the answer is a resounding yes. Because here's how their story continues. One day, it says, Zechariah was serving God in the temple. This was a week, it says, he was chosen by Lot to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and burn incense. While the incense was being burned, A great crowd stood outside praying. So get this picture. He's in there by himself. While Zechariah was in the sanctuary, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, attending to the right of the incense altar. Now remember, okay, there had seemingly been no God activity for centuries. So imagine seeing an angel for the first time standing there. This would have been as shocking for Zechariah as it would be for you and me right now, okay? So of course, we're told Zechariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear when he saw him. Of course he was. But the angel said, okay, don't be afraid, Zechariah. This is just kind of the standard angel response when you read the New Testament. Angels always have to start their conversations with don't be afraid. Why? Because when people saw an angel, they were afraid. Sure. Imagine if this were you, okay? Zechariah, he hadn't even done anything. He didn't have anything to be afraid of. But an angel appears to you, and you just start confessing stuff probably, right? He's like, I didn't mean to, and I always thought, and I promise, all this kind of stuff. And the angel's like, okay, chill out. Here's some good news, okay? Here's what the angel says to him. God has heard your prayers. I mean, I would just like to hear that sometimes, wouldn't you? Not even that your prayer is going to be answered. I mean, I would just like confirmation that God heard it sometimes. Like, I would just like to know, wouldn't you? What if God just whispered to you somehow and you knew it was God and he just said, I hear you. I've heard your prayer. I mean, that would, in some ways, that would be enough, wouldn't it? Just to know he heard it. The angel goes on, your wife Elizabeth will give you a son and you are to name him John. And this John is going to become a very famous John. He's going to be John the what? Baptist, exactly. I heard you. John the Baptist. This is how his whole story begins. And it gets interesting, okay? The angel goes on, he will turn many Israelites to the Lord their God. Now, why would John the Baptist have to bring Israelites back to the Lord their God? He's already their people. Well, because many of these people, obviously at this point, had abandoned the Lord their God, and they had good reason to do so. It's been a long time since God's done anything. God hadn't done anything for Israel in 700 years. You know, it was over for most of them. It was a myth. It was fun while it lasted. They were interesting stories, right, to tell their children, but if there ever really was a God, he had long abandoned Israel in the minds of most. So the angel goes on. He, John, will prepare the people for the coming of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children. He will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly. And then look at this. Zechariah said to the angel, how can I be sure this will happen? I'm an old man now, and my wife is also well along in years. And I don't know if you find the human is, you just got to love the Bible, okay, right? He's like, I'm old, and she's, well, you know, I know these things have a way of getting out there and getting written down and shared later. So let's just kind of say, well, she's well along in years too, right? In other words, he says to the angel, okay, I'm with you. I'm glad you heard our prayers, but I'm thinking you're a little late. We've been praying since we were in our 20s and 30s. And, we even went ahead and we kept praying for a baby into our 40s. We almost quit praying in our 50s. And now I'm old. And my wife, okay, she's old too. And the angel said to him, and I just love this. He's like, what do you mean, how do you know it's going to happen? I'm an angel standing in front of you, right? You're talking to an angel, and you're wondering how in the world this can happen. Look at this. The angel said to him, I'm Gabriel, bruh, right? I stand in the very presence of God. It was he who sent me to bring you this good news. But, maybe he's a little nipped, but now since you didn't believe what I told you, you'll be silent. You'll be unable to speak until the child is born. For my words will certainly be fulfilled at the proper time. And that's a really important phrase there, at the proper time. Wait, okay? You mean God had a day in mind, a proper time marked on his calendar. Like you mean these 700 years, and since the glory of the days of David and Solomon, God has waited this long on purpose for the proper time. You mean God has watched his people abandon him in droves, because it looked like there was no way in the world the nation of Israel would ever bless the world. We have no platform to bless the world. We're just another people that gets conquered every time a new conqueror comes along. And God has been planning this all along. Like there was a proper time? You mean God hasn't quit paying attention? He's not only heard my prayers, but the prayers of his people for generations? Yeah. You mean even though God has been so quiet, he's not been inactive. He hasn't lost interest. No. At the proper time. And all of this, okay, this whole story is just kind of the warm-up act. Just the conversation before the conversation. This was just evidence that God was gearing up to do what God had planned to do all along. Planning to do what those who had remained faithful generation after generation after generation, who died, who never saw the fulfillment of the promise, but passed it on to their children, the hope that the Messiah would come. Passed on to their children the hope that God might be silent right now, but God is still active. We have to trust. We have to hold on to hope. That there is a God who keeps his promises. And in every generation in Jewish life, there was a remnant of children who believed, and they grew up believing, and they passed it on to their children. And so finally, the day had come when God would put into action what he had planned to do, the proper time. The plan since he promised Abraham that every nation on earth will be blessed. So here's how this story concludes, and this is how our next story actually begins. Luke tells us in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a village of Galilee, to a virgin named Mary. She was engaged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of King David. So this is our story, isn't it? I mean, if we really think about it, this is our dilemma, right? Do we believe when God seems silent, when God doesn't seem to be showing up? Do we believe or do we stop believing? Do we serve or do we go on to something else? Do we give or do we just spend and know that there's nothing to life but what we see around us? Do we think about going back to church or do we just get comfortable, right? Do we stay engaged? Do we stay in that difficult marriage? Do we just do what everybody else is doing? Do we do the shady deal or do we continue to maintain our integrity? And we drive home just kind of thinking, why am I maintaining my integrity, right? Nobody cares. Nobody's promoting me. Nobody's even noticing me. I mean, in fact, they laugh behind my back at me because I say I have standards and I'm a Christian, and they wonder what I'm doing it for. And you know what? I'm beginning to wonder what I'm doing it for. Why am I so narrow, right? Why am I so conservative? Why am I always wondering what God thinks? Why am I so guilt-ridden all the time when I sin? Why don't I just do what everybody else does? Because it seems like God is silent. And you spend night after night after night just kind of thinking, this isn't really getting me anywhere. God's not doing anything for me lately. I'm not gaining any influence. I'm just falling behind. Well, in every generation, there is a remnant of God followers that decide whether or not they're going to remain faithful in spite of the fact that they see God seemingly doing nothing for them. And the good news is this, okay? If that's your situation, there's nothing wrong with you. If that's your situation, I just want to welcome you to the common experience of those who have placed their faith in Christ and who've decided to follow him in spite of what they see around them. Welcome to the world of Zechariah and the world of Elizabeth, a couple that decided, okay, we're going to walk blamelessly before God in spite of what we see, in spite of what people say, in spite of the fact that we can't even imagine how God would even give us a child, or how God would even use the nation of Israel to bless the world. We're nothing but another occupied Roman territory. But this is the dilemma that all of us will face or are facing now in our walk with God, in our spiritual journey. And the good news is, listen, it's normal. It's understandable. The challenge is, will you be a part of this generation's remnant? The challenge is, will you be that unique student, that unique young person, that unique couple that decides, okay, we're going to battle this out. We're not just going to walk away. That unique person, in the workplace that says, I'm going to maintain my integrity, whether I see God do anything in the present about it or not. Get this, okay? The story of Christmas is a reminder. It's a reminder that your faith in God is not misplaced. The season of Advent, of the arrival, it's a reminder that even when God is silent, God is not absent. And when it seems that he is still, it's not that he's uninterested. And even when we are convinced that he's uninterested, it has nothing to do with his plan for the world or for you. It's a reminder that God can do anything he chooses to do. It's a reminder that God does pay attention and is moved and is blessed by those who remain faithful. But best of all, listen, the story of Christmas is a reminder that your hope, that your faith is not in vain. At the right time, at the proper time, he came. That song we sing around this time of year, "O Holy Night," it was written a long time ago. The lyrics, they were actually written by a French poet. And I love this line in the song because it just so captures the idea of this message. Long lay the world. Long lay the world, like for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Long lay the world in sin and error. And here's a word we don't use a lot anymore, pining. Which means longing, it means praying, it means waiting. And Christmas is a reminder that our longing and our waiting and even our agonizing, it's not in vain. Your faith in God is not misplaced, but neither are your doubts and questions wrong. Advent is a reminder that God is the God who keeps his promises, even when it seems like his promises are absolutely impossible to keep. And that's why a weary world rejoices. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for the story of Christmas and the fact that God, you are a God that is very active, even when we can't see you. God, thank you for allowing us to read these stories today and to relate, even in our day, to the questions, to the doubts, but also, God, to the faith and the perseverance. God, help us to learn something from that. Would you just give us wisdom to know what to do in our own season right now, wherever we might find ourselves with you, God, would you give us the wisdom to know what steps to take next? And God, give us the courage to do it. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.